What does being a mouthpiece for truth and justice look like within our daily frontline? And how can we be agents of justice in the world in the 21st century? Last week in his sermon, Paul spoke about moulding culture and focused on how we are salt of the earth and light of the world. Paul listed a bunch of organisations that were birthed from the church, that were started to spread salt and light across our world. These organisations transformed lives and communities. They spoke up for the voiceless. They fed the hungry. They clothed the naked. They cared for the sick. They visited the imprisoned. They educated our children. They protected all creatures, great and small. As Paul said, these Christians and these church organisations over centuries inspired leaders and governments over the last 100 years to consider their own work and decision making. So today, most governments do provide healthcare, they do provide education and some sort of social welfare. A lot of these church organisations and Christians were simply responding to the needs that they saw around them and asked the question of how could they spread salt and light. As a means of caring for those who were ill, St. Basil of Caesarea founded the first formalised hospital in 369. Going back to the 5th century and the 6th centuries, it was Christians who brought legal protection to the children of the Roman Empire. Ulrich Zwingli persuaded the Council of Zurich to turn several local monasteries into orphanages. George Whitefield, the great evangelist of the 18th century, devoted much of his income to the development of orphanages in colonial Georgia. William Wilberforce toiled for years in the British Parliament to begin the modern movement to abolish the slave trade. English missionary William Carey was responsible for outlawing the centuries-old practice of burning widows in India. Later in the 1800s, Lord Shaftesbury, a Christian statesman, led the fight against child labour practices and fought to improve treatment of the mentally ill in Great Britain. The Children's Society was started by an Anglican Sunday school teacher who went to look for two boys who didn't turn up one Sunday and found them begging for food on the streets. Charles Spurgeon built at least 17 homes for elderly widows and an orphanage for hundreds of children of all races and backgrounds. 19th century African American woman Sojourner Truth, for over 40 years, was passionate advocate for the dispossessed and the human rights movement. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor and theologian who was active in the German resistance to the policies of Hitler and the Nazi regime. Through the vision and the passion of William and Catherine Booth for people on the streets of London around 1860s, the Christian mission was formed, and today we know that as the Salvation Army. Martin Luther King Jr. and his justice advocacy around ending racial segregation in non-violent methods for the rights of the poor and the labourers, and also against conflicts such as the Vietnam War. Corrie ten Boom, Oscar Romero, Elizabeth Fry, Mother Teresa, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Florence Nightingale, and the list goes on. People of faith who were mouthpieces of truth and justice in their front lines. Closer to home, in 1953, the Blue Nursing Service started from the West End Methodist Mission in Brisbane with just one nurse, Olive Smith. After taking a call from a distressed man who later took his own life, the late Reverend Alan Walker, determined not to let that happen again, started Lifeline, a 24-hour crisis support line that still is really important today. leading to the Methodist movement, Reverend Ivan Elkhorn establishing Lifeline's support centre in Brisbane. In 1975, Reverend Ed Smith took the first steps to fulfil a vision of people with disabilities being accepted into the heart of the church and the wider community. These people of faith, these communities of faith, saw a need and responded in whatever way that they could, often small beginnings, and have grown to be great and significant ministries today. When I hear and read about these stories, I can imagine the sense of disappointment and frustration that society and situations had led people to be so desperate for basic necessities. I can hear the cry for justice from these Christians on their front lines, whether it's the London streets or on the phone at a Brisbane church. When God places in our path or puts on our heart a story of injustice, it's not something that we can easily push to the side. We are drawn and pulled to respond in whatever way we can. If you are like me, sometimes we can place these historical people of faith on pedestals as legends that we could never be like. However, we need to remember that these people simply had the courage to take that first little step of faith that the Lord required of them. They were similar to us, and when they saw a need or an injustice, they felt God draw them to action, and they responded. I would guess that each one of us would have experienced, seen, or heard of some injustice during this last week. Some of that locally and perhaps in our own homes or in our own schoolyards or workplace or our neighbourhood. Some further afield in some other parts of our state, country or world. Some of these might be on a grand scale and require lots of people to work together as part of a movement to bring about justice and change. And some of these might be on a small scale that could be us saying something or doing something to help bring truth to a person or justice to a situation. Our passage from 2 Samuel today is what being a mouthpiece for truth and justice means. It reminds us all of who we are. Through chapter 11, David is acting like most kings have always acted, with power, using resources including people for his own gain, proving he is in control to hide his personal flaws. David is throwing away all that God can do with him and through him, and God needs to get David's attention. So Nathan is called to be that courageous mouthpiece for truth and justice. David was not only Nathan's king, but he was also a friend. Together they had planned for the building of the temple. Together they had discussed the revelation of the Messiah King. After the death of David's best friend Jonathan, Nathan becomes David's closest friend, the one that David shares his secrets, his hopes, his dreams with. Sometimes one of the most difficult tasks of any believer is to have that tough conversation with a close friend and to call them out for some wrongdoing. We need the courage to tell our friends when they have acted unjust. David had become consumed on power and position, and Nathan is sent in order to stop him continuing down that path. So Nathan decides to have that tough conversation with David, but in a creative way. Nathan arrives at the palace with a heavy heart and a simple story. Nathan does not approach David directly, but indirectly. A story that would touch a shepherd's heart. So Nathan makes his appeal in a judicial parable about a rich man and a poor man. Nathan makes his appeal to the compassion for the poor and the sense of justice within David. Nathan makes his appeal to that sense of right and wrong that he knows David has. The power of the story can only be demonstrated in its effects upon the heart of David. The story gets David to pronounce judgment on the crime before he realises that he is the criminal. David unleashed his fury and righteous anger on the fictional person within the parable, and he is clearly bothered and states that because this man in the parable does such a terrible act, he deserves to die. Then Nathan brings the clincher, the formal charge against David. David, you are that man. And these words convict David. God speaks to David as though he has forgotten these things, or rather, as though he has come to take credit for them himself. God has given everything David possesses. Had it been so long since David was a lowly shepherd boy that he had forgotten, or been distracted by his power and status? First and foremost, David's sin was against God. He had ceased to acknowledge God as the giver of all. He had ceased to look to God to provide him with all that he needs. Since Uniting Church's National Christian Youth Convention in 2001, held in Brisbane, Micah 6:8 has been a really powerful mantra for me. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In the scriptures, this instruction to do justice was especially given in regards to the vulnerable. I wonder how different believers and non-believers would answer that question. What does God require of us? I wonder what our world would look like if we, or even just the followers of Jesus, did what God required of us, as spoken by the prophet Micah. To do justice today is to follow the example of Nathan and all of the people of faith throughout the history of the church that have spoken truth and acted justly. If we want to truly follow Jesus, we must be committed to justice. And the simple reason is because Jesus is committed to justice. When we look at the Bible holistically, we see the command for every citizen in the kingdom of God to eliminate justice. What is that truth that needs to be shared with another in a loving and compassionate way? What is that injustice that needs to be addressed so that all people can be liberated and find life and life in all its fullness? True justice finds ways to empower the marginalised, enhance their lives, and offer them a safe place to thrive. A biblical standard of justice must be a core value that we understand is essential to the work of announcing the kingdom of God. Sharing the gospel and helping to make disciples is fundamental work of the disciple of Jesus and to the church. But we can't ignore the biblical command to speak truth with love and to act for justice. A number of years ago, a friend was sent by his work to Silicon Valley, California for 2 years. His project was to help the team to coordinate one of the world's biggest technology expos. This was a massive project with global status and multi-million dollar budget. After a number of months, he had started to notice some inconsistencies in the finances being recorded. Being a Christian, he knew that he needed to say something. And so after many weeks of sleepless nights and considering all of the evidence and the implications of the accusations he was about to make, he made a time to meet with his big boss. The response was essentially, "Keep quiet, otherwise you will go down too." My friend knew that he needed to speak up for truth and ensure that justice was served, but needed to do it properly. He resigned from his position and then reported it to the authorities. The result was significant for him personally, losing close to $86,000 Australian straight away, and as well as his reputation within the industry. Sometimes speaking out truth and standing up for justice can be costly to us in some way. However, the alternate options can be more costly to us in other ways. We know that we need to make sure that we do the right thing, even if others aren't. Sometimes these injustices might be on a grand scale, like my friend's, or it might be on a small situation that you notice in everyday living. It could be the calling somebody on negatively gossiping about somebody else behind their back, or it could be about someone who is oppressing or others through greed or power or abuse. Or it might be taking action for social justice issues within our community and society. Where and how can you be a mouthpiece for truth and for justice on your front line this week? What is God calling you to say or to do for truth and for justice?